So it's 2 o'clock now. I would like to welcome you all to this EGHRIN seminar on unpacking the global health side effects of the EU's pharmaceutical legislation reform. I think a few more people will join us, but I think we'll start nonetheless. We don't want to penalize those who are on time. Please have a look at the chat. Alberto just wrote a message into the chat that everyone, I think, will be muted to start with when we start the discussion later on when everyone can join in. You can either unmute yourself or have your question in the chat. So my name is Astrid Börner-Rodoreda. I'm faculty at the Heidelberg Institute of Global Health, and I also serve on the executive committee of EGHRIN. EGHRIN is the European Global Health Research Institutes Network, and we conduct advocacy on global health related issues at EU level. I've got two colleagues here from EGHRIN that I would like to welcome. Frank Kobilens, who is a professor of global health at the Amsterdam University Medical Center, and Alberto Rocamora, who coordinates the work of EGHRIN. They will both monitor the chat, so thank you very much in advance. Let me also now introduce our international expert panel. I will start with Katrina Perehudov. She's a health scientist and legal scholar with over 15 years experience in pharmaceutical policy work. She's assistant professor at the Amsterdam Law School and co-director of the Law Center for Health and Life at the University of Amsterdam. Katrina's research focuses on international and European aspects of pharmaceutical law in policy and equitable access to medicines. A warm welcome to you, Katrina. We're glad you can be here today. Then I would like to introduce Fatima Suleiman. She is a pharmacist and research professor in the School of Health Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Pharmaceutical Policy and Evidence-Based Practice. Her work has focused on pharmaceutical policy and ensuring affordability and access to medicines, both for adults and for children across a range of diseases. Fatima, glad to have you here on the panel. A warm welcome to you too. And then the third expert is Carlos Duran. He's an Ecuadorian medical doctor with experience in the fields of pharmacoepidemiology, pharmaceutical policy, and therapeutic information to prescribers. He's assistant professor in the Department of Data Science and Biostatistics at the Julius Center for Health Sciences and Primary Care at University Medical Center Utrecht in the Netherlands. He's also affiliated to the Policy and Research Center, Medicines, Information and Power at the National University of Colombia. And between 2017 and 2019, Carlos served as Vice Minister of Health in Ecuador. Carlos, glad you could join us for this panel. A very welcome to you too.
Thank you.
Let me just briefly explain the format. So I will give an introduction to the EU's pharmaceutical legislation reform, and we will then go into a Q&A. So there will be no PowerPoint presentations by the three presenters. We will ask questions and I will moderate that. And then we hope to, towards the end, to open it up to all of you so you can ask your questions. And if you have questions as we're discussing things, please put them in the chat. They will be taken up by my colleagues. So in April 2023, the European Commission proposed a pharma reform package with the intention to strengthen patient-centeredness, the European pharma industry and pharmaceutical innovations, in order to improve access to medicines, particularly for children's medicines, for antimicrobials, and for rare diseases. So these are diseases that affect less than 5 out of 10,000 members of the general population. The EU had already experienced access problems, shortages of medicinal products over a number of years, and that was worsened, as you may remember, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when crucial developers of the active pharmaceutical ingredient focused on their own markets, supplied their own markets. So this reinforced the EU's plans to become more autonomous in developing and providing access of pharmaceutical products to its population. The proposed legislation acknowledges that market forces alone have proven insufficient to stimulate adequate research for tackling antimicrobial resistance, but also for the development of medicinal products for children and for patients suffering from a rare disease. So this reform is weighing up the demands of the pharma industry and the demands of the general population, and it obviously takes into consideration affordability, which is a main consideration by EU member states. It proposes to reduce the period for data and market exclusivity, and that will enable the generic industry to bring their products onto the market more quickly. So this will likely also lead to more competition and bring prices down. But to incentivize research and development, the proposal is also to extend data exclusivity for a certain period, for instances, for medicines that address high unmet medical needs. It also provides other incentives, for instance, for developing needed antimicrobials. We will go into this in more detail in the discussion. So there's a number of important themes that are raised, from reducing medicine shortages to environmentally friendly medicines, easier access to information for patients, a stronger voice for patients in the respective committees, and also greater transparency overall. It's perhaps interesting to note that the pharma reform proposed by the European Commission has been mainly developed to improve the access situation within Europe. The original proposal by the Commission says very little about the EU's global role, despite the fact that the EU has a global health strategy. Now I have to see how I can, sorry, I just want to share one slide. I hope you can see this. Is it coming on? So the Commission is, in a way, a supranational authority. So commissioners are supposed to defend European interests, not so much their own national interests. And it is the body that proposes laws and policies. So the pharma reform was proposed by the Commission in April 2023. A year later, the European Parliament amended and adopted this pharma reform. It basically brought in global aspects that were missing, and looked at the likely impact of this reform on low and middle income countries. And the amendment and adoption happened before the election. And, as we all noticed, there was, a shift to strengthen the populist bloc in the European Parliament. We have not heard from the Council of the European Union. We are likely to hear from them next year. And then the three bodies, the Commission, the European Parliament, the Council, will have to decide basically on the way forward. And then it'll come to a second reading and finally the adoption. So it'll still be a little while before we have the final pharma reform, the final text of it. And in this hour, we won't be able to cover all the facets, but I hope we'll hone in on the major issues. And I would like to start now with Katrina. Katrina, your research examines global health impacts of the EU's pharma legislation. Now, we've said it focuses very much on the internal affairs. So in a nutshell, what are the implications for the wider world?
Thanks very much, Astrid, also for the introduction to this important topic. So the EU's internal pharmaceutical regulation can have a range of direct and indirect effects worldwide. And we've seen this with the existing regulation, examples from that. But we also know this from international relations theories about how the EU's rules travel internationally. Direct influences are caused because the EU makes rules that can create regulatory incentives or regulatory rules that are of global health relevance. And I think we'll probably talk about those in a bit. There can also be indirect influences where the EU's pharma regulation becomes essentially a template of rules for the rest of the world, that maybe the EU exports through trade agreements with other countries, or other countries copy these rules in their own pharmaceutical sectors at home. And throughout our conversation, I can bring up when we're seeing examples of these two types of influences. But what we know for sure from the past is that any changes to the EU's internal pharma law will influence legal rules that are adopted around the world. It'll influence regulatory practices abroad. It'll influence pharmaceutical company conduct in other countries outside the EU, as well as how those health systems are functioning and coping with medicines and their prices and their availability on those markets. And all of this will, of course, add up to an impact on patient care and human well-being worldwide. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can start with the direct consequences first. So can you give us some specific proposals in this revised legislation that has a global implication?
Sure. So one very concrete proposal is the proposals for developing antibiotics and the prevention of antimicrobial resistance. So if we think of the environmental risk assessment, which is already a requirement in the EU's existing pharma regulation, new rules would be introduced as part of this reform. And those rules, if adopted, would require companies to assess the environmental and public health risks associated with manufacturing antimicrobials across their entire life cycle, and specifically in manufacturing supply chains that are located outside of the EU, as well as inside of the EU, of course. But this is a really interesting acknowledgement of how the pharmaceutical life cycle that Europeans rely on is linked to the regulation and environmental protection going on outside of its borders. And so in this example, we see the Commission, which proposed this rule, trying to use the EU's market power to extend some form of protection to environments and, by extension, public health outside of the Union. And if this proposal is adopted, it could lead manufacturers to align with stricter EU standards. It would require manufacturers to align with these stricter standards if their products are going to be marketed in the EU. But it might also inspire lawmakers in countries outside of the EU to adopt these standards as well. Maybe while we're speaking about direct and indirect influences, I can give some examples of unintentional or indirect influences that we see proposed in the current reform. One proposal is from the Commission regarding the transparency of research and development funding, and the rule would require that companies disclose the public contributions they've received towards drug development of any new medicine that is authorized in the EU. And this information in turn would become public through an EU database. And this can have a global impact because that database, in theory, would be accessible anywhere and could actually help authorities abroad in low and middle income countries or wherever to understand the worldwide investment in the research and development of a new product that might come on their market or that they might be asked to reimburse. Alternatively, or at the same time, in fact, such a rule in the EU could inspire lawmakers in low and middle income countries to adopt similar rules for transparency and really push that medicines price transparency debate and information forward. And then a final example that I'll give of an indirect consequence is the European Commission and Parliament's proposals to change the data exclusivity periods that apply to medicines, and also to introduce this proposed transferable exclusivity voucher for antimicrobial innovation. And so in this example, the EU is aiming to incentivize new antimicrobials, but also R&D into medicines for unmet medical needs. And these type of rules could actually be mimicked by foreign lawmakers and exported outside of the EU in this way. I'll stop there for now. Please pick up on any of these that you'd like to discuss more.
Thanks very much. Yeah, you raised a number of issues, and I think we'll come to hopefully most of them during the course of the discussion. I would like to take you up on the issue of research and development. Data and market exclusivity has been mentioned or is very prominent in this pharma reform. So, in lowering data and market exclusivity, in a way, the pharma reform enables generics to enter the market more quickly. But, there are also instances where it's used as an incentive for the pharmaceutical industry. So can I ask all three of you, how do you assess this European proposal for revised data and market exclusivity standards in light of global health issues? Who would like to go first?
Okay. Carlos, you go first, and then I'll go after.
Thank you, Fatima. Well, what I can mention is a bit the recent history in countries as Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. Together with Fatima and Katrina, I think 3 or 4 years ago, we published a review on the impact of the European Union access to medicines in middle-income countries, and there we found out some interesting data from IQVIA, a private company collecting data on consumption of pharmaceuticals, and they reported that quite an impact of the free trade agreements that introduced this kind of data protection, 5 years of data protection and 5-year patent extensions in Ecuador and Colombia, and later on in 2016, 17 in Ecuador as well. And they also did some pre and post analysis in Ecuador, and they found a moderate reduction in the number and proportion of generic manufacturers of marketing generic manufacturers of medicines in Ecuador, especially of generic medicines in Ecuador, especially for generic medicines for hypertension. So we cannot say it is due to the free trade agreement. There is a strong association, let's say, or correlation on the free trade agreement and these losses and the reduction of competition on the generic market in Ecuador.
Thanks, Carlos. And, you were Vice Minister of Health from 2017, so I guess that coincided with that period. So how did you address the issues, that were brought about through the free trade agreement that, I introduced stricter TRIPS plus measures? How did you try to improve access to generics at the time?
Well, at the end of the day, once trade agreement is closed and approved by the corresponding parliaments, it becomes law to the parties. So it's difficult in that sense. And also, let me tell you in the audience something else, that these kind of agreements are normally treated as confidential. So there are very few people having the possibility to see really the trade agreement and what is written there. So I think this is maybe an issue for another kind of discussion, but there in trade agreements we need to improve a lot what we call transparency. But at the end of the day, I think this kind of agreements it only worsens the situation regarding access to medicines in middle-income countries. I mean, in fact, what could be the positive aspect to a country as Ecuador to have a strong data protection rule imposed by a trade agreement? I don't see any. It only gives more power to the pharma industry to oppose to any attempt to introduce generics or biogenerics into the market. Nowadays, biosimilar firms are approaching very slowly the Ecuadorian market due to the fears actually to being called to the court by breaking these kind of rules. And I've seen this several times in Latin America. So I will say that at the end of the day, it has more negative than positive impact on access to medicines.
Yeah, thank you very much. Fatima, from a South African point of view, what is your assessment?
Well, I just wanted to add something to what Carlos has said about the trade agreements. It is actually true that there's very little transparency, and sometimes there's very little input from health teams. It's more the legal teams and the lawyers that deal with it. So it's also about who then is in that round table when these things get negotiated. So that's very crucial. I'm going to try and be a little bit more hopeful, Astrid, in the sense that I'm going to say that if Europe is moving towards reducing data exclusivity periods, then that could be something that maybe LMICs could mimic and therefore reduce the patent periods within these countries and allow for earlier increase of genetic uptake earlier than what has been recorded. So I think that that is a positive, but I think you can't just have that. You have to have that link to strengthening of patent systems in LMICs to prevent evergreening and therefore exclusivity periods extending beyond what they should be because of what other so-called innovation is all about. And I think also what the patent system is undergoing at the moment is a discussion around or a debate around what actually do we mean by innovation as well. So it doesn't become me too and that sort of thing. So the data exclusivity must be written within those parameters, I think. And I think that if it works that way, then it could only do good for those that are in agreement with Europe or are actually following the principles of the European legislation. Thanks.
Yeah, these are, I think, also very important points. Yeah, the national patent laws in what one defines as an inventive step. Huh? Katrina, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, gladly. I think this is an interesting example of how the EU adopts standards for its own internal market and then eventually exports some form of them in its trade agreements, like we've seen with all of the consequences that it entails. And I find an irony in here is that if we look back to the origins of the orphan drug market exclusivity that the EU offers, the Commission initially proposed that with a global health justification, saying, look, some drugs that are orphans in Europe are actually also direly needed by low and middle income countries, and we could have a win-win here. Which I think is a great mentality to have. However, in practice, this regulation has also led to very few medicines coming on the market that are needed by low and middle income countries. One example is of bedaquiline, which has orphan status in the EU. But we also saw tremendous access barriers exactly because of patent rules that are applied internationally. Also to say that the EU's debates around data and market exclusivity actually go beyond the requirements in international law. So the standards that the EU adopts are standards that it deems important and useful for research and development of medicines, but they're not actually required or agreed on by the international community.
Thank you. And improved access is, in a way, at the heart of this EU pharma reform, but it's first and foremost meant for patients within EU countries and where we see, considerable differences. But we're not going to hone in on that in this seminar. I just wonder, Carlos, how is access in Europe, or how might access in Europe be related to access in Latin America?
Thank you, Astrid. I think there is a nice starting point of what Katrina said at the beginning, like the intended or unintended or direct or indirect effects of EU framework or rules, let's say. In this regard, of course, the marketing approval is one of the first steps to be able to access to a medicine, and the recent approval of the global benchmarking tool by the World Health Assembly encourages regulatory competent authorities to have which have not reached high maturity levels, meaning most of the regulators in low and middle income countries, to rely on those authorities that have reached those levels. I mean, US FDA and European EMA, and the idea of relying on decisions taken by a third party has been taken quite widely in Latin America. We did research in this sense some years ago, and we found out that nowadays, from 20 regulatory frameworks that were explored, 13 regulators in the region already adopted the rules, internal rules, to be able to immediately adopt any decision taken by European EMA or US FDA, Health Canada, or these decisions from reputed regulators. But the thing really here is, or the issue here is that the history becomes a little bit more complex when you see what's going on regarding the approval of new drugs, mainly new cancer drugs, by the European Medicines Agency. So let me here refer to a recent study by Francine Brenhaus from Utrecht University and colleagues. They evaluated the added value of all oncological drugs, 131 drugs, and the corresponding indications approved by the European Medicines Agency between 1995 to 2020. And they found that a large proportion of cancer drugs approved by the European Medicines Agency offer minimal or no benefit at all to patients. And mainly, those drugs were approved through expedited pathways. And this research follows also several other research with similar results. For instance, the studies by Davis and Kurt Davis and Hussein Dasi in 2017 and 2019, showing the lack of strong endpoints when new cancer drugs are approved by EMA, and the high risk of bias in half of the trials supporting these approvals, which might indicate that the effect might have been exaggerated. So, having said this, the impact of this kind of approvals on the Latin American and Caribbean health systems, and also economically speaking, is huge. We are approving drugs by reputed regulators, that were approved by reputed regulators, that are already super expensive, which are not allowing cancer patients to live longer and better. And I just want to finish saying that the European Medicines Agency has a big name among doctors and patients in Latin America. And if a drug is approved by such an agency, doctors and patients would intensively demand to use it, even going to the court, which is quite common in the region. So the impact really goes beyond, which is really what we can imagine. This can touch patients in the other side of the world.
Thank you. And I guess that talks again to these indirect consequences of mimicry, of just, acting on how the EU acts and copying that. Fatima, can I ask you, how is access in Europe linked to access in Africa, or particularly maybe in Southern Africa?
I'm going to touch on 4 main issues, but I'll start with the one that Carlos has mentioned right now, because we have the same issue in Africa and even Southern Africa, in the sense that the AMA works a lot with the regulatory agency in terms of strengthening them, getting them to get to the standards, as Carlos mentioned, that are benchmarked by WHO. So this fast track mechanism that's been introduced by both the FDA and the EMA creates pressure on regulatory agencies in Africa, because they're not fast tracking those high cost medicines on surrogate measures. But patients are seeing that Europe and US are getting access to these medicines, and they want them. And they don't understand that these are vertical programs within these countries. There may be incentives for them to be at a higher price and come in at a higher price. They may be for a selected population and so forth. And they're not really through all of the rigorous evaluation that has gone on previously. So that expectation can be difficult, and it can put a lot of pressure on governments by civil societies. The other bit is that where the flip side of it is where the EU has been really good for Southern Africa and Africa, in the sense that they work with WHO to sort of look at registration of medicines that may not be required in Europe, but can be pre-qualified by WHO, and therefore faster access tracks in these countries where this is required and where regulatory capability may not be too strong. So there's that positive. So those are the 2 things to deal with regulation. And I think that the next bit I want to bring to mind is what Katrina mentioned in the beginning, is that they starting to implement this shortages database, which I think is way overdue globally, because you need to know what's actually a shortage that's within your area, but what's a shortage as a global basis, and be able to deal with that. And we're seeing the awakening of governments and regulatory agencies on this, with this insulin crisis that's happening right now, with Novo Nordisk withdrawing some of its formulations from the market. And the reason I'm saying that it's needed is because it needs to be preempted. So this is a good thing, because you're pre-warning agencies and governments that this is going to happen, and they can start the systems education that needs to happen to prescribers and educators. So there's not such a big issue at the user perspective about, oh my God, we don't have this anymore. What is the issue? Is the government running out of funds? And they don't understand that this is actually maybe a global environment rather than a local environment issue. So I think that having this database and then countries emulating this would be a good thing. And it's a long overdue as far as I'm concerned. The last bit that I want to touch on about the impact is this whole idea of transparency for research and development related costs. The World Health Organization has been discussing this forever. I see Alison's part of the group as well. She's been part of the fair pricing conferences where we've had this discussion of transparency of these costs. What is a fair price? Should we have differential global pricing and that? So an attempt by a major group of countries that are really strong to get this underway as per WHO resolutions on transparency would also be something that's really good, because then you have access to information on actually what these R&D costs. You have access to information that informs your own price negotiations. And then maybe we can have a true conversation about global differential pricing in relation to what the income groups and willingness to pay of countries are. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Katrina, did you want to add on to what Fatima and Carlos have said?
Yeah, I might add another example from the EU's reform where the EU could have an impact on access in low and middle income country markets. And that is of the proposal by the European by the European Parliament to introduce a joint procurement mechanism for antimicrobials. So this would be a sort of voluntary subscription-based tool where EU member states can volunteer to join the group and essentially pay in to a contract over several years that would ensure guaranteed supply of certain antimicrobials to supply those markets. So it could be good for industry because it's a guaranteed market. It's good for member states because, you'll have a sustainable supply, as many countries inside and outside Europe struggle with shortages. And what is also very encouraging about this proposal is that the Parliament proposes to attach important conditions to this contract that companies must meet. One of those conditions is what they call an antimicrobial access plan for countries in need outside of Europe. And this would require manufacturers that have contracts with the EU to create access plan for supplying non-EU countries, which could bring an added benefit of guaranteed supply, reduction in shortages or stockouts, provided that the price that, of course, is put forward in these access plans is affordable for the target countries. And I find this to be a really interesting example of how the EU could leverage its own market in order to encourage access in other countries. And now the example is for antimicrobials, but if it works and if the kinks are worked out, it could potentially be expanded to other sorts of products that are needed in low and middle income countries and in Europe.
Thank you very much, Katrina. And you mentioned the problem, and it's a growing, obviously, global problem of antimicrobial resistance. Already in 2016, it was estimated that by 2050 we'll have 10 million people dying from, related to antimicrobial resistance. A study in 2019 showed that in 204 countries we're already close to 5 million deaths related to antimicrobial resistance. So what the Commission proposed was that, in addition to good stewardship of using antimicrobials for developing new classes and new needed antimicrobials, there should be a transferable data exclusivity voucher as an incentive. And this voucher would grant manufacturers an extra year of data exclusivity on any of their drugs. So, you know, they'd be free to use that, and the possibility to sell the voucher to developers of other medicines. And they foresaw an evaluation after 15 years. Now, the European Parliament has brought that evaluation period down to 5 years and demanded transparency on any indirect funding the company receives and on information who it sells the voucher to. But how do you see these vouchers now as an incentive for developing novel antimicrobials that could also benefit global health, not just EU health? Anyone?
Well, I think it could be a good idea because you need new initiatives to promote R&D in these kind of developments, especially where you're going to use antibiotics only in really severe cases. So they're not going to be volume sold in a way. They're going to be for very resistant organisms in a way. But I think Katrina had mentioned previously that there has to be conditions to these as well, Astrid. So if you're having an incentive, first of all, you need to be able to monitor and evaluate the intended or unintended consequences of these. But secondly, they need to be coming with affordability clauses. And in some way, if a company feels that they're not going to be able to manage sales in all parts of the region, then they should be able to engage with other companies through technology transfer to be able to do that for regions that are underserved. And the reason I say that is because we had that during COVID. You know, we had these new medicines that were developed, and then they were restricted to those that were willing to pay the high prices, or, you know, to other regions first. And most of the LMICs in Africa and Latin America were left behind on access to those vaccines and so forth. So yes, having the access plan, but how does that access plan address a global crisis, and how does it ensure fair and equitable distribution during that time, and how does it deal with affordability and technology transfer as well in that regard? So those are my major concerns with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatima. And also one difficult that has been pointed out is that pharmaceutical companies will probably use the voucher against one of their blockbuster drugs. So that will, you know, where they can achieve sort of a high price. So in a way, you know, we have the benefit of maybe another good antimicrobial as compared to having high prices for another year for a blockbuster drug. So it affects then maybe other patients. From a public health point of view, how do you assess this?
So I think that that's where the transparency in pricing across the regions comes into play as well, because then you'll be able to see kind of whether there's equitable access, not just in terms of volumes, but maybe price differentials across the globe as well. Secondly, that the transfer voucher agreements need to be made transparent as well. So what are the incentives, but what are also the kind of cautionary things governments are putting in place to ensure that these are not abused, that it's not a price dictated by the pharmaceutical company, but there's some sort of negotiation between different stakeholders to come to a price where you can see R&D development more in these companies, but it's not, you know, at the cost of patients for your shareholders in a company in a way. So those kind of things need to be very explicit, I think, which at the moment these agreements are not very clear. And then I think that, again, when we're talking about these transparency, I'm talking about sustainability of supply across the globe as well. We've seen it not just with COVID, but now with the new GLP medicines, you know, the issues in relation to who gets access, who pays the price, when do things get registered in a country. So if you're having these access strategies, there should be timelines. It shouldn't be open-ended to say, yes, you need to develop a plan and that's it. It should be within a certain number of years, you need to be able to ensure that these countries have these things either registered, or there's a subsidiary in that region who's making the medicine or can supply the medicine and so forth as well. So I think for me, those are additional issues that need to be attached to those agreements. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatima. Carlos, Katrina, would you like to add?
I agree with what Fatima said, and maybe just to emphasize that a good R&D investment, a good R&D incentive would bring certainty for health systems about what the cost of that incentive will be. And right now, this voucher is like a blank check for European health systems. So there's some good things built into the voucher, like this transparency of R&D costs, but there needs to absolutely be predetermined checks on and limits in place.
I can imagine that maybe participants also have questions on further incentives. You already mentioned one or two. There's also the milestone awards that are mentioned by the European Parliament. So maybe we can discuss this in a minute. But the high prices have been highlighted by all of you as issues. How could prices be brought down? We know that generics obviously are usually a lot cheaper. The medicines patent pool has proved, I think, a good one-stop shop for providing new needed drugs and new combination, like for instance with children's medicines in the HIV field. But it's not mentioned because the pharma reform really focuses on the EU, and the EU does not benefit from the medicines patent pool because it's intended for low and middle income countries. Well, what do you think? Should it have been mentioned if it had a more global outlook?
Well, I think the thing with medicines patent pool is that, of course, it has been one of the greatest tool ever to fight access to medicines over the years. But it's also true that several middle income countries mainly, and several of them in Latin America, are just out of the agreements. So this is a bit of mixed feelings by the fact that you are called middle income country by the World Bank. You just not deserve to have a voluntary license. So yeah.
Maybe to jump in, one way that the concept behind the medicines patent pool could have been brought into the EU's reform is if European lawmakers acknowledged in the conditions that they place on companies receiving benefits from data exclusivity, market exclusivity, or the voucher, that if those companies get those benefits, then they also need to contribute their knowledge, know-how, and intellectual property to technology transfer initiatives such as the medicines patent pool or some other comparable, reputable mechanism, and in that way do their part in global health. So that is perhaps one missed opportunity in this reform, where the EU could have actually gone a step further and added more conditions towards these incentives that would not only benefit Europeans, but also the international community.
I also just want to add that I agree completely with what Carlos and Katrina have said, but I also want to say that they have taken one step that we should acknowledge, which is ask for transparency in R&D costs, which is really, really a good step. So if we do this maybe slowly, we get to the point where we can say we want all of these. So even though we're saying that there are some flaws to what is being proposed, the big step that they have taken is about transparency in R&D costs, which is very much appreciated, I think.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions, but I think I would like to allow a bit of time for participants to ask their questions. So Frank and Alberto, could you maybe see what's in the chat?
Frank?
Maybe you can just, yeah.
Yeah, there's a question from Jonathan Cervello. I don't know if he wants to build up on it, but it's about if the European Commission has learned the lessons from Bedaquiline on access to medicines for orphan diseases. If you see any lesson learned in this regulation.
I think in terms of the specific example of bedaquiline, to my knowledge, that example has not been discussed, and the barriers to international access have not been discussed widely in the EU debates. However, the whole premise, I think Astrid mentioned in the beginning, the whole premise behind the reform is that the orphan incentives have yielded the low-hanging fruit, the orphan drugs that were relatively easy to test and bring on the market, but they've been rather unsuccessful at addressing the areas of higher unmet medical need that are where they're more difficult, where it's more difficult to bring therapeutic options to the market.
Jonathan, has this answered your question, or do you want to come in and ask for further clarification?
No, this answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, Alberto or Frank?
There is also a remark on pharmaceutical accountability issued by a NGO. I understand working on that. I don't know if I will allow to activate the sound in case Wilbert Vandenberg wants to say something else. And maybe we open the floor, if you agree, Astrid, for anyone to raise their hand if they want.
Sure. Yeah. So any of the three speakers addressing the question we just heard?
Okay. I was invited to speak, but you can't see me, so because I'm not yet allowed by video. So,
Oh, okay.
Anyway, you see our logo. So the Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation is trying to actually help access to medicines problems, especially excessive prices, through legal means. And there are guidelines that we made for. Sorry, thank you for allowing me. Okay. Guidelines for NGOs, for governments, and for governments as well. And it's rather a minefield. But anyway, if there's any interest in using law for actually redressing some of these problems, then please read the guidelines and we can help you more. I don't want to take more of the time. I think it's enough to say that Fatima and Katrina know our organization pretty well. So, and the new work we're going to start in next year is on access to expensive essential cancer medicines in low and middle income countries and compare it to the high income countries. So.
Thank you very much. I see a question by Albrecht Jan. Albrecht, do you want to pose it yourself?
He should be free to unmute himself and activate the camera, but otherwise he can also.
Now? Yeah.
Yes,
okay,
it's working.
So greetings to you all. Yeah, I just wanted to know specifically because the pediatric legislation is also part of the new reforms. We have done some studies on the previous, I would say, very mixed effect of the pharma legislation. And is there any change that makes you optimistic that access to pediatric drugs will be improved or maybe even worse? What is your assessment with respect especially to the pediatric legislation?
Who would like to take the question on the pediatric legislation? Katrina?
I have to disappoint you. First of all, Albrecht, wonderful that you're here. And actually, I would pose this question to you, given your work that I've enjoyed so much on this topic. As far as I know, there are a few pediatric considerations are built into the small changes, eventual changes to data and market exclusivity. But just like all of the proposals in data and market exclusivity, I think what I conclude from them is that lawmakers have an interest in taking some sort of legal measure to try and improve the situation, but they're just not sure what, because these data and market exclusivity rules, I mean, they seem to be more of a political negotiation than a particular science behind them. So those are my thoughts. But I'd be very interested to hear from you or anybody in the audience who's reflected more on the implications for pediatric medicines.
Can I also clarify whether you mean just Europe or globally?
I was more looking at the global effects, yeah, not within Europe. Yeah,
Yeah.
whether there are, let me say, kind of positive spillover effects, which also result in better access to pediatric medicines, or even, let me say, more development or more investment in pediatric medicines. And I mean, we have assessed what is the current state of affairs. So, and I'm not so familiar with the latest revisions. That is why I asked, is there any major change expected? Or is that part more or less unchanged?
Well, I mean, I know that what has happened previously has had a mixed effect. So it would be nice to see what has changed, because the mixed effect has been that there's been a greater focus on pediatric medicines and formulations. So there's been an increase in formulations, but I think mostly for non-communicable diseases, not so much for infectious. Those are slowly coming through. The problem for the LMICs is that some of these new formulations are more expensive than the tablet formulations, and they have budget impacts when you're looking at procurement and listing these medicines. So the issue becomes the fact that it's available, it's there, but you can't as a country afford it because it's too expensive, and therefore it's for a limited population. And then we tend to look at pediatrics as one group, but they actually are not. You need syrups and suspensions, but then you need chewable tablets for those that are going towards more teenage and adult years. So when we look at that, I think that there needs to be a little bit more discussion about the variations in formulations required for this group, and then the prioritization of conditions that you need to look at. And I'll come back, because this is my bugbear at the moment, is the affordability issues as well. You know, so somewhere along the line, we need to be able to say that these should really not be more expensive than what is currently on the market as well. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then we've got another couple of questions in the chat. One is by Fabrizio. Is there any mention of the environmental impact of new medicinal products, which is another big issue, the environmental considerations? Katrina, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So this is getting this area is getting more attention in the proposals, and one major change would be, well, let me say the current situation is that companies must complete an environmental risk assessment when they apply for market approval in the European Union. And however, currently that risk assessment, whether whether the assessment itself is robust and well done, or whether the mitigation measures are good, that actually has no bearing on whether the product ultimately gets market approval currently. Now, in the reform, it's proposed that poor mitigation measures or a poorly conducted risk assessment could mean that it is a reason to deny a product market approval in the European Union. So this new sort of enforcement mechanism for considering the environmental impact of medicines is taken to an entirely new level. It's given a lot more prominence, and in fact is sort of positioning the right of an individual patient to access their medicine in a way against the right of people to live in a healthy environment that is unaffected by pollution from pharmaceutical production, for example. So I think this is an interesting development in EU law, and certainly is one way for the EU to enact its One Health approach in pharmaceuticals.
Has this answered your question, Fabrizio? I can't hear anything.
He indicated in the chat.
Okay, fine. Then we've got one more question, as I see, from Andrew Farlow. He's writing, there has been use of priority review vouchers for those developing drugs for neglected diseases in the past. what lessons did that have for the transferable voucher just discussed? I believe over 60 PRVs have been issued, and there is some controversy over their value. They're actually very different vouchers. Yeah, the transferable data exclusivity vouchers basically give you, extended. How shall I put it? You've got another year of data exclusivity. That is not the case with the priority review vouchers. It just means that it doesn't even mean expedited review. It just means that your medicine is considered a priority for the review. So the only consequence that I see is that other drugs will then have to maybe wait in line a bit longer, but I'll leave it to our three experts to answer this question.
I mean, I don't really have a strong data to prove whether it has been, I mean, a good or not, or a bad action. But I personally think this is a good thing, and not only for neglected diseases, but also, at least in the Latin American context, for essential medicine. So I always try, when I have the opportunity to talk to regulators, policymakers in the region, I always propose them to include this kind of incentives to all drugs that have the etiquette, let's say, of the ticket of essential drugs. So, but I cannot say that much about this. But in general, I think it's a good thing. Yeah.
So my experience has been with some sort of prioritization exercise like this voucher was introduced, so not necessarily the voucher itself. But one cautionary tale is that you have to also put in caveats as to how many within a particular disease area would get the voucher before you get everybody trying to get into a particular oncology area or a particular multiple sclerosis area, so that you get this distribution across the conditions. So I think that would be a cautionary tale, in that the data exclusivity vouchers may maybe just be limited to a certain number per disease grouping or something of that sort, in that regard, to ensure you have R&D across all conditions.
There's one last question I'd like to pose together with maybe your final statement. So there is a question by Christiane Fischer: who does guarantee the need for the quality of drugs? Is this included in the new pharma legislation? And maybe you can just then sum up that what should the EU do now to make sure that this pharma reform has a positive impact globally? So maybe you can just do one last round. And I would also ask all of you, if you don't mind, to put your camera on. I think Alberta would like to take one picture, if that's okay with everyone. So who would like to start? Carlos, can I ask you to start?
Well, I think that the important, from my point of view, what's important is that Europe has, I mean, acknowledged that at the end of the day, Europe is a global regulatory power. It's the impact, or what's happening inside, is really going far beyond the European boundaries. So I think this is my call, and probably I will finish with some of Fatima's words. I mean, some of these global problems should be issued by a global thinking, by a global way of a global community, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. Fatima?
So quality, safety, and efficacy of medicines are written into Medicines Regulatory Authority job descriptions. So they do take care of the quality of the medicines issues. But I think that by some of the things that are written into the new reform, which is transparency, environmental, climate impact, incentives to ensure encouragement into neglected areas, are positive things. I would only ask that there be a monitoring and evaluation system set up to look at the intended and unintended consequences, not just for Europe, but globally as well, because we all work in a global environment. What you have happen in one area is not going to be limited to that area. So I would just ask for that. Thanks.
Thank you. Katrina?
Thanks very much, Christian. About quality, indeed, that's still covered in the regulation under requirements for manufacturers and also inspections, and then that data is also considered in a market approval application. So that is still there. One ask that I would have to the EU is to sustain the conditions on public funds that it already has, and the granting of public measures like regulatory approvals. For example, sustain the requirement for transparency of in public investments in R&D. But also in these final months, introduce, where possible, more conditions on how public funds are used. For example, requiring technology transfer or global access plans when the public funder has contributed to the medicine. And then a final point I wanted to make is about how the EU does play a very clear global role in the field of pharmaceutical regulation, but where is the global health perspective being brought into the EU lawmaking process? That's been mainly through the parliament and even there through concerned civil society organizations that are raising these concerns. And we see a drastic reduction in funding by independent organizations for the access to medicines advocacy going on in the EU. So the final concern I want to raise is, what is the future for the global health perspective on medicines when it comes to EU policymaking?
Thank you very much, Katrina, Carlos, and Fatima, for sharing your insights, your expertise. Thanks very much also to Alberto and to Frank for monitoring the chat, and thanks to everyone for participating, for asking questions and being active. Could I just ask one last time, maybe those who are still a bit shy to put on their camera, could you just put on the camera for 1 minute so Alberto can take a picture, and then we close the meeting. I can't force you, of course. If you feel like you are uncomfortable, then that's fine. But it would be nice to see everyone.
Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, done, Alberto?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for taking part in it, and
Thank you
all
all.
the best to all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.